morning, everybody. It's Pastor Mel, and I just want to invite you to consider this morning a different sort of power. So I want to begin by asking, what comes to your mind when you think of a kingdom? This can be an imaginary kingdom or a literal kingdom from today or centuries ago. I know some of the things that came to my mind are a monarchy, an all-powerful king or queen, castles and guards, strong walls of protection, a separation from the working people and the king or the ruler, infinite wealth, money, jewels, crowns, heirlooms, priceless art, entire land under one authority. All of these rather simple examples are and so many more, are precisely what our human understanding thinks a kingdom is about. For millennia, humankind has been accustomed to sources of power that segregates the rulers from the peasants, from the workers, the everyday people. And this separation forces the masses, you and me, to submit to the will of the ruler of the day. And this problem of power, this perverted sense of what it means to be an authority, it's nothing new. Like the author of Ecclesiastes says, there's nothing new under the sun. Whether we're talking about the cycle of the upright and then the evil leaders, the kings who ruled over ancient Israel, good and bad, or our modern day variations of government, which there seems to be endless iterations of, it's clear that our human construct of power continues to fall short of good news. The prophetic text we read this morning on this third Sunday of Advent was from Isaiah 61, and it paints a very different portrait of a kingdom. This is from the Message version, the first 4 verses of Isaiah 61. "The Spirit of God, the Master, is on me, because God anointed me. He sent me to bring good news to the poor, heal the brokenhearted, to announce freedom to all captives, pardon all prisoners. God sent me to announce the year of his grace, a celebration of God's destruction of our enemies, and to comfort all who mourn, to care for the needs of all who mourn in Zion and give them bouquets of roses instead of ashes, messages of joy instead of news of doom, a praising heart instead of a languid spirit, to rename them oaks of righteousness planted by God to display his glory. They'll rebuild the old ruins, raise up a new city out of the wreckage. They'll start over on the ruined cities, take the rubble left behind, and make it new." This is one of my favorite passages of Scripture. I could meditate on it every day, probably. But in this kingdom, the kingdom described in Isaiah 61, there's a leader being commissioned to bring good news to the oppressed. So what would sound like good news to the people we know who are dealing with poverty from a place of powerlessness? Would good news look like sincere eye contact and a genuine listening ear? Would it look like discovering the uniquely brilliant gifts that this person has to offer the world and helping them find a place to contribute? Would it look like welcoming and belonging? In this kingdom, the one in charge will work to bind up the brokenhearted. How many modern kings or presidents or prime ministers can you think of who genuinely care about the sadness of a single person living in their land? What would it look like to have a leader who not only cares for one heartbroken person, but for the disappointment and loss and grief of every single person under their authority? And it doesn't stop there, but this leader then begins to find help for each one of them, counselors, friends, spiritual directors, neighbors, orchestrating a whole support system for those suffering internal wounds. What would it look like to have a king who proclaims liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners? What? Yeah, Isaiah prophesies that in this kingdom, the one in charge is declaring pardon for all those who have done wrong. and insisting that every person held against their will in unsafe homes or workplaces be freed. Now, I can't assume to understand exactly what this would look like, because of course we know there are people in this world who only seek to harm and hurt others. But maybe if we can set aside our perception of the world and use our imaginations to enter into this alternative kingdom, we might begin to see that this ruler isn't releasing people into a chaos and unsafe environment. Because remember, this ruler knows each member of their kingdom, their gifts, their brokenness, and they want to bring each person healing and wholeness. Sound familiar? This ruler sets out to show love to even the most despised, the most reviled criminals, and to restore them to the fullness of their design. Like I said, I don't know what that would look like, but I think God's stretching our imagination to imagine, to ponder what that would look like, the possibility of it. Friends, it's obvious that this kingdom, God's kingdom, is completely contrary to our understanding of leadership and power. It's hard, impossible really, for us to wrap our minds around the ways God has and will continue to bring his kingdom to earth as it is in heaven. Just this morning in my email inbox, I received the daily meditation from Henry Nouwen, one of my beloved pastors, an author who passed away, I'm not sure exactly when, but he writes this: "It is hard to believe that God would reveal his divine presence to us in the self-emptying, humble way of a man from Nazareth. So much in me seeks influence, power, success, and popularity, but the way of Jesus is the way of hiddenness, powerlessness, and littleness. It does not seem a very appealing way. Yet when I enter into true, deep communion with Jesus, I will find that it is this small way that leads to real peace and joy." And when Jesus came and put on flesh and made his dwelling among us, he was willingly stepping down from the throne of authority. He crossed the lift bridge that kept the commoners separated from the royalty. As scripture says in John 1:14, the word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. God became flesh and moved in right next door. Jesus, God incarnate, came and lived among us. There are no boundaries, no separation, no barriers. Jesus experienced pain and loss, friendship and laughter, sickness and death, just as we do. Jesus came to us in the smallest and most vulnerable forms, a newborn baby with complete reliance on others. God's presence among us wasn't clothed in royalty and crowned with obvious authority. Jesus' birth was ushering us into a new way of life, inviting us to participate with God in this work of building a new kingdom, a kingdom that willingly sets aside influence and power and success and popularity, and instead seeks to serve and work alongside and delight in the small gifts of life. I believe Nouwen hit the nail on the head when he describes the fruit, the results of a life lived in step with Jesus. Real peace and joy. As we move through this season of waiting and anticipation for Jesus to be born in us today, I urge you to spend time considering, what are your perceptions of power? In what ways do you seek power or prestige or popularity for yourself? How do you view punishment and treatment of the poor or those who've done wrong? What do you believe the role of authority should be? And in all of this pondering, I want you to ask God's Spirit to reshape your mind into a kingdom perspective. This is the work only God can do in us. Because if you desire to follow in the way of Jesus, you can ask God to show you what perspectives and ideas you might need to change or let go of entirely in order to follow in this way. And as we go, may these words become our hope and our prayer as we move through the days and weeks ahead. This is from O Holy Night. Truly, he taught us to love one another. His law is love, and his gospel, his good news, is peace. Chains shall he break, for the slave is our brother, and in his name all oppression shall cease. Go in peace.